Morning, ladies. Before we get started, just going to put out a little plug here. On May 1st, which is after Bible study's over, it's the very next Wednesday, we are going to do a Women in the Word field trip, if you're at all interested. We're going to go to the Leslie Hale Tabernacle in the Wilderness and Bible Museum. It's in Tarpon. So we have a sign-up list out at the registration table. The times are pretty much like Bible study times. We're going to meet at the museum by 9:30. The tour begins at 10. There's no cost for this, but they do ask for a love gift at the end. The information's on this flyer. There's flyers at the desk as well. We can make more copies if we need to. Doesn't have to be exclusively Women in the Word. If you have somebody you'd like to invite and bring along, that would be great. Also, we're going to do lunch afterwards. So we're going to Mama's in Tarpon for some Greek food. We've got Nancy Hughes took care of all of this, thank goodness, and I'm thankful for her. But she went ahead and took care of this and went and spoke with them. So for $14, we get a drink, we get a dessert, we get our lunch, and it includes a tip. So the way that we're going to do it is they want it all in one check. Women in the Word will just cover the cost, and then everybody will just pay us the $14. So sometime between now and the end of April, our last meeting, we need you to, if you're interested in going, you need to sign up and pay your $14. So like I said, that sign-up's out there. Any questions? Nancy, there she is. See Nancy. And we say thank you to the Girl Scouts of America for her organization. Okay. Alrighty, we are going to go ahead and move through. We have lots to cover again today. We just seem to have more and more of the Word to cover each week. We're going to start at Genesis 45, verse 16, and we're going to move through chapter 17, verse 12. I'm going to go ahead and read that in its entirety. So beginning at verse 16, chapter 45. When the news reached Pharaoh's palace that Joseph's brothers had come, Pharaoh and all his officials were pleased. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Tell your brothers, do this. Load your animals, return to the land of Canaan, and bring your father and your families back to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you can enjoy the fat of the land. You are also directed to tell them, do this. Take some carts from Egypt for your children and your wives and get your father and come. Never mind about your belongings, because the best of all Egypt will be yours." So the sons of Israel did this. Joseph gave them carts as Pharaoh had commanded. He also gave them provisions for their journey. To each of them he gave new clothing, but to Benjamin he gave 300 shekels of silver and 5 sets of clothes. And this is what he sent to his father: 10 donkeys loaded with the best of Egypt, 10 female donkeys loaded with grain and bread and other provisions for this journey. Then he sent his brothers away, and as they were leaving, he said to them, "Don't quarrel on the way." So they went up out of Egypt and came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan. They told him, "Joseph is still alive. In fact, he is ruler of all Egypt." Jacob was stunned. He did not believe them. But when they told him everything Joseph had said, and when he saw the carts Joseph had sent to carry him back, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. And Israel said, "I'm convinced my son Joseph is still alive. I can go and see him before I die." Chapter 46, so Israel set out with all that was his, and when he reached Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in a vision at night and said, "Jacob, Jacob." "Here I am," he replied. "I am God, the God of your father," he said. "Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again, and Joseph's own hand will close your eyes." Then Jacob left Beersheba, and Israel's sons took their father Jacob and their children and their wives in the carts that Pharaoh had sent to transport them. They also took with their livestock and possessions they had acquired in Canaan, and Jacob and all his offspring went to Egypt. He took with him to Egypt his sons and grandsons and his daughters and granddaughters, all his offspring. These are the names of the sons of Israel, Jacob and his descendants who went to Egypt. You can read those on your own. We are going to move forward to verse 18. These were the children born to... 19. No. 1 minute. I had this all marked out this morning. 26. All of those who went to Egypt with Jacob, those who were his direct descendants, not counting his sons' wives, numbered 66 persons. With the 2 sons who had been born to Joseph in Egypt, the members of Jacob's family, which went to Egypt, were 70 in all. Now Jacob sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to get directions to Goshen. When they arrived in the region of Goshen, Joseph had his chariot made ready and went to Goshen to meet his father, Israel. As soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. Israel said to Joseph, "Now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive." Then Joseph said to his brothers and his father's household, "I will go up and speak to Pharaoh, and you will say to him, 'My brothers and my father's household, who were living in the land of Canaan, have come to me. The men are shepherds, they tend livestock, and they have brought along their flocks and herds and everything they own. When Pharaoh calls you in and asks, 'What is your occupation?' you should answer, 'Your servants have tended livestock from our boyhood on, just as our fathers did.' Then you will be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen, for all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians." Joseph went and told Pharaoh, "My father and brothers with their flocks and herds and everything they own have come from the land of Canaan and are now in Goshen." He chose 5 of his brothers and presented them before Pharaoh. Pharaoh asked the brothers, "What is your occupation?" "Your servants are shepherds," they replied to Pharaoh, "just as our fathers were." They also said to him, "We have come to live here a while because the famine is severe in Canaan and your servants' flocks have no pasture. So now please let your servants settle in Goshen." Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come to you, and the land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in Goshen, and if you know of any among them with special ability, put them in charge of my own livestock." Then Joseph brought the father Jacob in and presented him before Pharaoh. After Jacob blessed Pharaoh, Pharaoh asked him, "How old are you?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers." Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. So Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramses, as Pharaoh directed. Joseph also provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food according to the number of their children. May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. So, we see that God again shows up as rescuer. He rescues Jacob and his family. The Egyptians who had been asked to leave the room at the end of our last lesson, where we finished up last week, they'd been asked to leave, but they were still within earshot, and they could hear what was going on in there. They could hear Joseph with his brothers reunited. So they went off and they reported to Pharaoh what was going on, and Pharaoh rejoiced that Joseph's brothers were now with him. He was happy for them. Joseph was the savior of the nation. He was the second in command of Egypt. And Pharaoh wanted to give his family, his brothers, a royal welcome. So Pharaoh's words not only verified what Joseph had promised, but he promised even more. He said, "I will give them the fat of the land. I will give them wagons to carry their families. I will give them whatever possessions they need." And all because of Joseph, all because of God's sovereign hand. Jacob's household had the great ruler of Egypt working on their behalf, providing for their every need. So we see in verses 22 to 23, there's some gifts given, there's things given. Joseph's brothers, if we remember, had taken his coat when they sold him to the merchants, but now he was giving them each new clothes. In Scripture, we've talked about this before, a change of clothes, putting on new clothes is often the mark of a new beginning. And this was a new beginning for the sons of Jacob. Also, they had sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver. Joseph gave Benjamin 5 times that. Joseph provided extra food. He gave 10 extra animals. He gave them wagons, carts to draw whatever they needed back to Egypt. And in verse 24, in his God-given wisdom, he sent his brothers away and he said, "Don't quarrel along the way." Don't quarrel along the way. He knew his brothers well. The matter had been settled. He'd settled it. It was done. Once, done for all. There was no need for his brothers to discuss it further, try to fix anything, try to put blame on anybody else, or to measure their guilt. It was done. It was forgiven. So verses 25 through 28 just show when they returned home. Jacob was happy to see them all safely home, especially happy to see Benjamin, but he was not prepared for the rest of the news that was coming. Joseph was alive. He wasn't only alive, he was the second ruler of all Egypt. And he wanted the entire family to come and live in Egypt, and he would provide and care for them all. Now in verse 26, in some translations, it says Jacob's heart fainted, that he was stunned. It literally means that his heart grew cold. It grew numb. It's like when we say, I almost had a heart attack. It was that type of amazement. The news was too good to believe. But his spirit was revived as he thought and about being reunited with Joseph, being reunited as a family. Now in verse 28, Jacob was 130 years old at that time. He will die when he's 147 years old. So there will be 17 years where he will be living in Egypt in peace with his family, with all together. No one separated. Now it's likely at this time that the brothers explained everything, what had happened 22 years before. I'm sure they apologized. I'm sure they explained details. I don't know if questions were asked. We don't know what conversation happened. But there was reconciliation within this family. They were again unified and united. I'm sure he believed every word they said, because we know Jacob was suspicious for the last 22 years of his sons and their heart motives. And we will see in chapter 49, when we study that, on Jacob's deathbed, he will gather his sons around him. He will tell them about each one, and he will tell them of God's plan for their future. Now, if we think again of the sovereignty of God, and we see here the sovereign God, he has overruled the plots of sinners. He's overruled it. He's accomplished his will for Jacob, for Joseph, for his brothers, for the nation of Israel. And for the next 400 years, the Jews will be in Egypt, first as honored guests, then as suffering slaves. But through it all, God is at work molding his people. He's molding the nation to be what he needs it to be and to do what he needs them to do. So as we move into chapter 46, they set out. We see God's promises. Jacob and his family left Hebron, and they traveled for about a week, and they arrived in Beersheba. It's the southernmost town in Canaan. So it's the last town that they're going to go through, leaving Canaan. Now Beersheba was special to Jacob. If we think back, Abraham had dug a well here. Abraham had lived there after offering Isaac on the Mount of Moriah. Isaac had lived there. It was from the home in Beersheba that Jacob left and went to his uncle Laban's to search for a wife. And at Beersheba, God had appeared to Hagar, had appeared to Isaac, and now he was going to appear and speak to Jacob. Jacob was about to leave the land he knew. Even though he was still a pilgrim there, he knew that land. He was familiar with that land. He was going to enter an unknown land. So at that time he stopped. He built an altar to worship the Lord. And I think it's good for us to remember, it is good to ask for God's help. It's good to ask for his blessing when we're entering new phases of our life. Not just at those times. We need to be seeking God's face, God's hand, God's blessing every minute of every day. So I believe Jacob was fearful, most likely to head to Egypt. Even though Joseph had instructed him to come, and it was a wise move. I mean, the famine was destroying the land, and many people were dying. But we have to remember the history that he most likely heard from his grandfather and from his father about Egypt. His grandfather Abraham had gotten in some trouble in Egypt. We remember that. We studied that in chapter 12. And when Jacob's father Isaac started towards Egypt, in chapter 26, the Lord stopped him. Egypt was a dangerous place, especially for a Hebrew. But God came. The Lord came to Jacob at night, and he assured him that he would be with him. He said, Jacob, Jacob. He calls him by name. And I thought, isn't it encouraging? God knows our name. He calls us by name. He knows our personal need. Is this light like going on me? Jehovah. God, he wanted to remind Jacob he wasn't limited to the land of Canaan. God wasn't just in the land of Canaan. He's the Lord of all the earth. He will go with Jacob wherever he goes. That includes Egypt. God would go with Jacob to Egypt. He would bless him just as he had blessed Joseph. Jacob had nothing to fear. He was encouraging him. He was letting him know, I keep my promises. I promise you. I will keep every promise I've ever made to you. And that began back when Jacob was at Bethel in chapter 28. Now, God also gave Jacob an added assurance. He was going to die in Egypt. When he said, Joseph will close your eyes, he's telling him, you're going to go there and you will stay there and you will die there, but you will be in the presence of your son Joseph. He will close your eyes. Assuring him Joseph would see to his funeral. Joseph, he knows and he trusts, would be sure to make it an honorable occurrence. Jacob's body would be brought back to Canaan. It would be placed in the cave where Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and Leah had all been buried. And on the basis of these promises and the assurances of God, Jacob went forward and he moved to Egypt. And as we see these lists, the record lists first the sons, the daughter, and the grandsons of Leah in verses 8 through 15, followed by the families of Zilpah in verses 16 through 18, Rachel verses 19 through 22, and then Bilhah in verses 23 to 25. A total of 70 people, including Joseph and his family. But in typical Semitic fashion, the males are named, only the males. The only female listed here is Jacob's daughter Dinah in verse 7. And then they refer to, in verse 7, they refer to daughters, plural, meaning most likely the daughters-in-law, since we know that Jacob has no other daughters. So when we look at this list alone, knowing it doesn't include any of the daughters of the females, if we think about his descendants, look how it's grown. Abraham and Sarah had one child. And we look at how God is multiplying these descendants. And his descendants would be numberless, is what God's promising. Your descendants will be numberless, like the sand on the seashore, like the stars in the heavens. And we all know the Lord keeps his promises. And then we see God's goodness as we go further into this chapter, verses 28 to 30. He had chosen Judah. It says he sent Judah ahead to find out the plans, to find the directions. He sent him as their guide. Now that's indicating that he trusted his son. He trusted Judah. Judah was representing the family now. He had most likely come clean with Jacob, most likely confessed the whole ordeal. And Judah now proved himself faithful. And his descendants were eventually named the royal tribe. And then we see that they settled in the land of Goshen. Goshen is the northeast part of the Nile Delta. It's about 900 square miles. It's fertile. It's excellent for grazing cattle and herds and flocks. And that was the fat of the land. It was given to them. Now, this is not the same Pharaoh. This is the son of the initial Pharaoh that was ruling. So his son is staying true to his father's promises, to Joseph, and allowing Joseph to continue in this place and in this position. Now it's here, in this new land, where Joseph finally is reunited with his father. And in verse 30, Israel said to Joseph, "Now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive." Now we know, we've always seen in Jacob, he's the glass half empty guy. Focuses a little bit on the negatives instead of the positives. And it seems here he's a little preoccupied with sorrow and death. I've seen you, now I can die, instead of thinking we can live joyously here as a family. And especially the fact that he's now with Joseph. But you see his focus is even on, okay, I'm satisfied, now I can die. But we look at Joseph, his dreams now had all come true. Now was the season to live united with his family. And the rest of the verses are spent just showing the kindness of Pharaoh, the favor that is on Joseph and his family. Now, although Pharaoh had agreed to allow Joseph's family to settle in Goshen, we see the brothers still had to appear before him. It was a formality, but it was an important formality in Egypt. They needed to be officially presented as resident aliens in Egypt. Now, I'm sure Joseph, and it says he prepped his brothers. This is what we need to say. This is what we should focus on. This is what it means to be a shepherd in Egypt. And the fact that Jacob's sons had brought their flocks, they had brought their herds, they were intending to continue working in that capacity. Now, knowing that Egyptians were prejudiced against shepherds, they had to be aware of how to present who they were and what they intended to do there. And that's where Joseph was helping them. But they remained honest and they remained upfront and forthright through all their dealings with Pharaoh. Now, we don't know which 5 brothers. Wouldn't it be interesting to see which 5 brothers he chose? We don't know. But he chose 5 of his brothers to represent the family. But rest assured, they were God-appointed. God gave him the wisdom. God gave him the direction of which brothers to choose. And Pharaoh kept all his promises. He gave them the best of the land for their families, for their flocks, and for their herds. This is 70 people. A family of 70. 900 square miles of the most fertile land of Egypt. He also requested, when he heard that they brought their flocks, they brought their herds, he heard that they have been working in this capacity since they were children. He requested, to Joseph, he said, if you know anyone who's talented in that, they can handle my herds too. So here they are all of a sudden, quite a promotion for these 11 brothers. One day they're these ordinary resident aliens. The next day they're Pharaoh's official herdsmen. They've been elevated as well. And the only word I could think of here was favor. God's favor. His favor was on them. I pray it all the time. If you've ever talked to me personally, I tell you, I pray for favor on my kids. I pray for favor on John at work. I pray for favor. God's favor. And that's what we see here. We see it beautifully illustrated. And then Pharaoh and Joseph's father meet. The first thing Jacob did was bless Pharaoh in the name of God. He also blesses Pharaoh at the end of their time together. And Warren Wiersbe said, we see in this that Jacob was a good example of how a true believer is to relate to those who are outside the family of God. And if we look at Jacob's life, if we choose a metaphor for Jacob's life, it would be that of a pilgrimage. Some of us look at our life and we can think of a metaphor for our life. It's a race. It's a battle. It's a puzzle. It's a tapestry. The patriarchs were pilgrims. They were strangers on earth, but we are as well. This world is not our home. Our time here is short, it's brief, it's temporary. And we need to be looking forward to our home in heaven. In verse 9, Jacob tells Pharaoh, he says, "My years have been few and difficult." He's 130. "My years have been few and difficult." Not really few compared to what he's saying is Abraham lived to be 175. Isaac lived to be 180. So compared to my fathers, my years are few. You're shorter. The word evil doesn't imply wickedness, rather misery or distress. He's saying my life, my days, they've been few and I'm full of distress. Jacob's life had been difficult at times. But God was going to give him 17 years now of peace and happiness in his united family, in this land that was uncomparable with where he had come from. And we see Joseph was this excellent administrator. He used every gift that God had given him. He handled his family's relocation. He presented it to Pharaoh. He dotted every I. He crossed every T. And he did it in an admirable way. And if we think about it, this land, they were devoted to the worship of numerous gods and goddesses. And here comes these people who believe in the one true God. And God was counting on them. They're going to bear witness to me. They're going to bear witness. And their conduct is going to reveal who I am in this foreign land. So again, we see the sovereignty of God characterizing this story. I went back to Proverbs 21, verse 1. The king's heart is in the hand of God. He can do anything he wants with that. He will direct it in any way that he sees fit. He changes the hearts of kings. We cannot deny seeing God at every turn. You look back in this story, God's fingerprints are all over this story. Every sorrow, every joy, we cannot deny his presence. We cannot deny his presence in our lives as well. Every minute of every day, every joy, and every sorrow. And when you get that glimpse of God, you see it. You sense his power. You sense his presence. And you cannot help, when you acknowledge who he is and what he is doing, regardless sometimes of when you're looking around and it's looking kind of dark, when you truly acknowledge his hand in all of it and his control of it all, nothing but praise can flow from your lips. And may his praise forever be on our lips. I told God I'd share this, but I had enough time. I have 3 minutes. Last week I shared about some of my fears. And I just said that a lot of times the motivation of my thoughts and my words and my behavior and my plans and my ideas, and then the Lord said, and your schemes. I don't like to call them that, but God does. And some of you know that my daughter Madison is at USF and she's in the nursing program, and she applied to the nursing program officially. She did all her pre-nursing stuff, and it is the top nursing program in the state of Florida right now. Over 800 people apply for 80 spots. Wow. She got one. Just like Nina was just saying, God, it's God's favor. It's God's hand. And I have prayed for God to open doors and close doors. Just open or close, whatever it is, whatever it is. But as I prayed about this, I also prayed from my own mother's heart to say, close it, God, and let's yank her out of there and start new somewhere. Because I have a lot of fear about what goes on there and the choices she's been making there. So she got in. And truly it was mixed emotions. I'm ecstatic for her, but at the same time, it's like I'm having a really hard time dealing with the fear, the what if stuff. And I'm forecasting grief And then that's when I shared last week, I have got to give these fears to God. I cannot live and react to Madison out of my fear.
Amen.
So I tell God that, and I write it in my journal, and I pray it, and people are praying for me. And then I thought, I could maybe just write an anonymous letter to someone and kind of say all the things that I know are going on over there.
That's a scheme.
I know, right? I know where to send it to. I know who to send it to. I typed it up. I addressed the envelope. Yes, I did. I did not send it. It sat on my desk. And I knew that little good judge in me, my spirit said, no, don't send it. I left it on my desk for a week. And I'm telling you, every time I passed, I wanted to send it. I was wrestling with my flesh. So one day, after praying, because the Lord has me reading Jeremiah, this is what I read that day. Jeremiah 11, verse 15. What is my beloved doing in my temple as she works out her evil schemes with many? Let me tell you, when God is speaking, you don't doubt it.
Amen.
I'm like, oh my gosh. I got up, I took the letter, and I ripped it up, and I threw it in the trash. And I knew, God, I know I'm not supposed, I threw it out. I want to confess to you all, I wrote another one. I'm not kidding. But do you see, Satan continues to whisper, I believe all this. I stand up here and teach this. I study this all week long. I wrote another one. I've carried it around in my car. It's in my car because I don't have the stamp. And I'm like, God, I'm going to get a stamp. I'm going to put a stamp on there. It sat in my car. And then I thought, this is all I thought about over the last week. Think about Abraham and Sarah and their scheme. Think about Jacob and Rebekah and their scheme. Didn't work out real well for them, right? There was delay, there was heartbreak, and it was all because of their fear and their schemes, because they think they have to help God. I gotta make this known. I have to help God. Now, eventually the blessings came. Those blessings came. And God's will was done, but it was a much more difficult path. And I'm looking at Joseph. 22 years. He could have schemed. He could have written notes back. He could have said, look what my brothers did. It's all a secret, but I want you to know. He could have done this. Not one time does it say he even entertained the thought. He still had years of waiting. He still had years of suffering. But he trusted God. It wasn't the easy path. It was no easier than the others I mentioned. But he was characterized by trust and hope and faith, not fear. It was like God was saying to me, don't focus on not fearing. Focus on joy. Focus on trust. Focus on faith. Focus on who God is. Because when I look and I trust in our God of unshakable plans and unlimited resources and ultimate authority and unstoppable hope, I don't need to write these things. And so I left it I didn't even think about it. I left it in the car this morning. I'm like, I have to take that in. Then I'm sitting here and I'm like, well, I don't necessarily need to have it in here. I can just tell them about it. No, I need to show you. And so I rip it up. And I'm not writing another. But all I'm saying to you is, I don't stand up here in front of you all and don't ever think I don't deal with the lies and I don't deal with fear. I do. And we have got to be encouraging each other, and we have got to be standing firm, and we have got to be believing in this God. Amen. Because when we don't, I'm so... Like it makes me sick that I would even think to write it. But we do those things in our weakness. And sometimes we go through with it. And I'm going to tell you, it's not that God's not going to leave me and He's not going to watch over me and He won't have His will done. But it will be delayed. I believe it. Delayed even more. The path even more difficult because I walked it in disobedience and mistrust. So when we walk that path of obedience, it is a difficult path sometimes. And it'd be so much easier for us to do what we can justify our flesh. But we need to look at Joseph and we need to say, look at this man. Look at his character. Look at the favor that came because of it. And I'm not saying I'm doing this because now God's going to just like shower blessings all over me and my family, but I'm going to walk it in a better way. I'm going to walk it characterized by hope and trust and not focusing on my fear. Because my fears are ripped up in that letter. Doesn't mean I'm not going to try to pick them up again. I'm definitely not going to write the letter again. So let's focus on God, our God of unshakable plans, our God of unstoppable hope. He is so worthy of our trust and our faith and our obedience. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, God, I love you. And I am amazed at how you love us, despite our weaknesses and our fears and our failures. And our steps toward disobedience, our steps towards scheming. God, let us call a spade a spade. Let us call it what it is. It's scheming. It's sin. It's mistrust. God, help us to see those things. Help us to rip them up. Help us to cast them onto you. And may we be women of obedience, women of trust, women of hope. May your peace and your joy be overflowing from our lives through the power of your Holy Spirit. And it is through that powerful Spirit that I pray. Jesus. Amen.
Amen.